Probably of all the classes that we'll have together, this is the one where I wish I had much more time and much more opportunity to work with you on these concepts. We will be working through a lot of different concepts very quickly. There are a lot of additional resources, which when I ultimately have this book prepared, these resources will all be cited and noted. But those of you who are students at Lipscomb, anytime you're back on campus, please know that I've got an extensive library about each of these particular topics, and if you're interested, I would love to share with you some of my library if you want to delve into any of the aspects that we'll be talking about in this particular unit, because this will include not only a discussion of what we call the classic apologetic arguments, but one thing that we could talk about extensively is this intersection of faith and reason and the relationship that those two ideas have. Some would suggest it's the discussion about faith and philosophy, philosophy being based on human reasoning powers. And there have been volumes written on this particular discussion. So the best I can do is present to you how I view this, and I would hope that this would be useful to you. I'm not making any claim, of course, that I am correct here. I do want to raise the question of the appropriate criteria through which we can discuss these matters. But I do think it's a relevant question that in this age of reason, even though in postmodernity we're sort of past that idea of being able to fully ascertain truth through our empirical senses, still the question is can any belief at all in an unseen ultimate being have merit? Does the Christian faith warrant belief? And so it brings up this question of the relationship between faith and reason. And we've talked about this for the entire course, that here we are, we find ourselves in an intellectual environment, in an institution of higher learning, and you find yourself in the adventure of learning even in a different place in the world, because you're trying to expand your understanding of life. And so what is the relationship between faith and reason? And this is an argument that has been entertained since times, at least times of classic Greek philosophy, and in some of the discussions that Aristotle brings up, and certainly Plato and Socrates and others, in terms of trying to understand what is the relationship between the unseen and the seen, and is it reasonable to believe that there is an unseen, and does that unseen trump that which is seen? And so this is a discussion that has gone on for all of human history. And there are at least three major possibilities, and there are a lot of subcategories of these possibilities. The first is the idea of faith and reason being in tension. And this is probably the one that is most popular in today's world, and I'll mention more about this in just a few minutes. But this is where the idea is that if you have a Christian epistemology and then you have a rational epistemology, that is, an understanding of knowledge, that those two are in competition with one another. And so there are a lot of different visions of this, and interestingly, the camps that would normally not have anything to do with each other might agree on this. For instance, there are very traditional fundamentalist Christian groups that think that reason itself is a tool of the devil. This was advocated by Martin Luther as well. The idea of reason and rationality and all of that being tools of Satan to pull us away from faith. And so there are those who would advocate that we should simply embrace faith, whatever the Bible says, do it, and reason, our ability to consider whether something makes sense or not, just simply gets in the way of true faith. Then on the other side of that, of course, there are those who adhere to the idea that reason is truth and that faith has no business invading the realm of reason, and that faith is just a creation of humankind because of its weakness to want to know something beyond itself. Then there is the faith-seeking understanding through reason approach, and this one is advocated by a lot of different people through history. But the idea here would be that God gives us the capability to reason. Therefore, the faith that we embrace can be strengthened greatly through this reasoning process. In fact, reason itself, in a sense, is defined by faith. that if you have a faith in God, then you believe that He has given you the capacity to reason. And in this case, rationality itself is redefined by a Christian view or a faith-based view that precedes reason. So you have faith preceding understanding, or faith coming before understanding. So in this camp, one who has faith would see reason much differently than one who does not have faith. And then you have the Thomistic synthesis view, where you have faith and reason that are in synthesis. And the book that I used to use in this course called Living at the Crossroads, which I would highly recommend, a great book by Bartholomew, Goheen and Bartholomew. But they give you the historical development here that I think is quite interesting, and we just simply don't have the time in the context of this particular study. I would highly recommend that you study this, though, because what Thomas does, basically, Thomas Aquinas, reintroduces Aristotelian logic into the West. That Aristotelian logic had basically been lost, and the West was fully Platonic in its view of the world, which meant physical things, material things were evil, and spiritual things were good, and life was about escaping the evil of the material world toward the good of the spiritual world. And much of Christian development, especially in the 4th and 5th centuries, was greatly influenced by Neoplatonism. And so what you have with Thomas is he reintroduces the idea that matter itself is created by God, therefore there must be elements within the material world that lead us to a better understanding of God. And so you have faith and reason being different languages of the same God, both of them speaking to the creation of God. Now, I would tell you quickly that it's sometimes very difficult to distinguish between faith-seeking understanding through reason and the Thomistic synthesis. They have similarities. And the difference between the two, I suppose, is a difference of degrees, where what faith-seeking understanding through reason certainly puts much more emphasis on the idea that you begin with faith, and then faith defines your very understanding of reason, while faith and reason in synthesis would be more of two languages of the same God. And I suppose if I had to define where I would find myself somewhere between the two, because I do think that faith changes how you see the world dramatically, and even the way that you define rationality. But I also think that all sciences, in some way, shape, or form, have to be the language of the God who created them, and that God gave us the capacity to better understand Him. And so these are very similar to each other, and actually may have a deep relationship with one another. All right, let me highly recommend, there are all kinds of books here I could recommend, but let me mention at least a couple that I think are very significant. 2014, fairly recent book, published by InterVarsity Press, is Mary Poplin's Is Reality Secular? The subtitle being Testing the Assumptions of Four Global Worldviews. And I just think this is a fascinating read. Mary Poplin's story itself is a very interesting one, where she was raised in a strongly religious home, walked away from faith, made some really poor choices, came back to faith. And so she's explaining how her world was redefined in this her own search of faith, and she has some fascinating personal experiences that make this book very readable and very helpful. But it may be the most profound work I have seen on the topic of faith and reason. So again, Mary Poplin's Is Reality Secular? And then secondly, this format of book, it's a particular genre of book that I really like. And it's where you have people present different views of the same topic, and then they interact with one another and respond to one another's essays. And this one's one of the best I've seen, the title being Faith and Reason, and then three views, edited by Steve Wilkins. And so you have the three prominent views that I've listed above, argued, and then I think it's a really good discussion. It's not a debate as much as an interesting intellectual discussion that I have found to be very helpful. So I would, if you're interested in this discussion, I would highly recommend that you would pursue it there. But here's the major question. Do we have a reason? Do we have reasons to believe? See, what we've talked about so far is that we all live in the story that we believe to be true. And is this a story that those of us who, as Christians, have to dismiss as valid, our intellectual properties, or what is the relationship between those things which we see and experience and that which we ultimately believe? And so the task of apologetics, if you're not familiar with the term apologetic, it's simply making a defense for that which you believe. And there are basically two themes of Christian apologetics. There are negative apologetics, and that is responding to barriers or objections. And every world system, every second order story has things that would cause people to negate their validity. And so negative apologetics is not being negative, it's simply defending against those things which seem to go counter to the believability of a particular belief system. And in this, we need to carefully listen to the concerns and offer thoughtful responses. Those of us who are Christian need to be aware of the fact that there are many questions that can be raised about believing in a good and loving God in a world that is so broken. And so we call that negative apologetics. Now, I'm not going to be dealing with that much in this unit. I will deal with that under abduction, which we'll talk about in the next unit. And because I think that's the best place to fit in the discussion of, well, the number one objection to believing the Christian view of the world is believing in a loving God in a world that is so obviously broken and full of sin. And so how could a loving God permit such terrible suffering? And so I want to deal with that in the context, again, of the abductive argument. But we do need to carefully study, the defender needs to carefully study these objections that might be raised. And obviously they first have to be resolved in our own minds. So if we're not prepared, we can't answer. So this is going to be an important aspect of our discussion. The second part, which is what we're going to be dealing with in this unit, or what we call commending apologetics. These are positive apologetics. And these are things which allow the truth and the relevance of the gospel to be appreciated by the conversation partner. These are things which give people reason to believe. It makes the message something that people want to hear. Now, there are a couple of things that I want us to consider here. First, the limitation of apologetics. You're not going to convince anyone to become a Christian through argument. Argument does not produce affection. However, when we talk about apologetics, this is not about having a zinging answer for anyone's particular objections to a belief system. This is rather about being prepared to explain what we believe and why we believe it. And we recognize that there's going to have to be something much more than just a particular argument that will bring someone to belief. So apologetics alone will not change the heart of the person who does not believe. And we need to understand that what we're doing is offering a view of life. We're not demanding anything. It's really important for us to recognize that we're not in a position of demanding belief, but rather we're offering warrants for that which we do believe. So I believe that as Christians, our task is to help people realize the wonder and joy of walking with Jesus as our sovereign Lord, and that living the ways of Jesus is the best possible way of life. And so I think often of these parables of the kingdom found in Matthew 13, and I've had the joy of this experience in my own life of seeing people. In the first story, you have an individual who's just walking across the field, and it's clear in the parable that he has no plan or purpose other than walking across the field, and he stumbles across the treasure. It wasn't that he was looking for it, he simply stumbled upon it. But he immediately recognized the value of it was such that he would give up everything that he had to be a part of that. In other words, it wasn't a sacrifice on his part. He gave up everything because he was gaining something of much greater value. Then the second parable is one who had been searching and searching and searching and searching for the perfect pearl. He's a pearl merchant, and he'd purchased pearls all over the world, but he wanted that perfect pearl, and finally one day there it was. And he immediately recognized it after all of his seeking and sold everything that he had in order to obtain it. Now, the response of both of those individuals is the same, but what motivated that choice was remarkably different. One had no idea he was looking for anything and then found something of such great value could not let go. The other knew exactly what they were looking for, but had maybe even given up on finding that until one day there it was. So here's the point, is that the story of Jesus ought to be such that it is like the hidden treasure. When demonstrated in its fullness, it ought to be something that whether a person is looking for it or not, they would recognize the value of it. And so this brings us to a phrase that I really like that I borrow from John Stackhouse in his excellent book on apologetics. The title of his book is Humble Apologetics, and I used it for several years in this course. Would highly recommend it. But what he says is that we need to learn as apologists to give winsome inducements which are ways in which we increase the interest of an individual to the discussion of God. And again, everyone has a framing story, a second order story, a map of reality that they're following. They're giving their life in a particular way every day. They're waking up and spending the economy of their life in the story that they ultimately believe to be true. And so my question is, can you commend your story, if you're a Christian, can you commend your story as a better story? So what might the missing piece be to life? Because a lot of people that I know seem to acknowledge the fact that something in their life is missing. I had the opportunity a year ago to go on a trip with my family. Every 4 years I take spring break off of a mission trip and take it with the family. And so we took our extended family, and I have, of course, it'd be my wife, 3 married children, and 5 grandchildren, went to Disney World. And it was so much fun. But watching the amazing numbers of people and all the different things, here's a man who built a dynasty around a mouse drawing. I mean, it's just amazing what Walt Disney did with one particular concept, that he would create a make-believe world based on everyone having fun, but the main character being a mouse and his girlfriend. So if Jesus is truly the Christ, meaning the anointed one of God, what might we do in helping create a kingdom around this idea? It takes some imagination, but it also takes conviction that that which we are offering is what is good for the world. And so the joy and the power and the purpose of the ordered life is something that we need to recognize as being the real key to inviting anyone to embrace this understanding of life that can only, I think, be found in Christ Jesus. And this brings us to a really important idea. And it's the idea of the soul. You know, what is the soul? A book that really helped me with this is a book written by my good friend John Ortberg. I've mentioned it before in this class, but it's where John here is talking about soul keeping or taking care of yourself, and he talks about the fact that we all have these aspects of our personality. And as he, by the way, talks about in his book, he borrows this from the great theologian Dallas Willard. But we all have a will, and we also have a mind, and there's a difference between the two. If you disagree with that, and how many times have you had the will not to eat something, but somehow you eat it anyway because your mind somehow is stronger than your will? And then you have your body, which is also a part of this. You're trying to control your body, and you have your body and your mind and your will, and they all seem to be competing against one another. And then you also have social interaction, that is the world in which you live. And so you have these elements in your personality, and so many times they're at war with one another. And what I want us to think about is, and we may come back to this a little bit later in the semester because I think this is such an important discussion, is what story best orders the entire person, because that's what the soul is. The soul is the soul is not a tiny particle within the will. The soul is the entirety of the person, and it's either ordered or disordered. And so when you see the phrase in Scripture, lost soul, it's not that there's that little spiritual aspect of a person that is misguided. It's that the entire life of that individual is out of balance. And that what Jesus is talking to us about is a reality where the mind, the soul, the mind, the will, the body, one's social interaction are ordered in a purposeful way that makes life meaningful and purposeful. So this is when Jesus comes to save our souls. It's not to save some kind of little bitty invisible aspect of our personality that somehow is going to escape the destruction of this world. It's that he would order our entire life so that we live the good life for which we have been created. Now, if we're going to effectively communicate this, those of you who are communication majors will be offended by what I'm going to do here, but I'm going to give you a really quick overview of effective communication. And I think this is particularly relevant when you find yourself in an environment where you are not the native, you're trying to understand others, and you're trying to effectively communicate. But it begins with an individual who is trying to communicate something to another individual. And so they have a thought in their mind, and how are they going to communicate that thought? Well, they've got to somehow create a message. Now, the message is not in the thought itself, because we think in abstract terms, we don't think in words. So what we have to do is encode the thought that we have into words, and then we speak those words, or we communicate that message verbally or non-verbally. And some would strongly suggest that our nonverbal communication is every bit as important as our verbal communication. So in some way, shape, or form, we're encoding this message, which then has to be decoded by the listener, because words don't mean anything to him either. They represent ideas. And so what comes into his mind? Has he received that message? Now, especially when we talk about something as deep as faith, recognize that we're trying to put into words incredibly complex ideas, and especially in the face of differing languages. We may be translating our deepest thoughts into another language, not knowing whether those words themselves create the same picture. And because of that, we need to recognize that in all communication there is noise. And in theory of communication terms, noise is anything that interrupts good communication. So this is not just noise, it can be actually audible noise, which makes communication very difficult. Sometimes it can be the psychological condition of the person to whom you're speaking. If they have something tragic that's happened in their life, that becomes a noise in terms of their ability to receive and accept other messages. And so feedback becomes absolutely necessary if we're going to have good communication. And so as we move ahead and start talking about what does it mean to share our faith, or is the Christian faith warranted, recognize that just because you're using words that make sense to you does not mean the person to whom you're speaking is hearing the same thing. And so be very attentive, be very prone to listening. Do everything you can to make sure that you understand where that person's coming from, or you're going to miss an amazing opportunity to be able to really affect the way that that person thinks. So let me share a few thoughts about how to effectively communicate, again from John Stackhouse in his book, Humble Apologetics. And he believes that truly defending one's faith begins with the gift of listening and understanding and analytical sympathy, so that you're open to the plausibility of others' beliefs. So I think this is a good practice, that whenever you find yourself talking to another, first seek to understand what they believe before you try to give them a reason to believe differently. And be open to the plausibility of others' beliefs. And I could spend a lot of time here, but please listen to this. People believe what they believe because it's the best thing they've heard that best interprets their life. People don't believe something because it's silly or non-believable. They believe it because they believe it. And so try to understand why they believe what they do. And recognize the immensity of the conversation here. We're talking about something as deep as the basic way in which we see the world. And I tell you how important I have found this to be, is that most people that I've met, especially in the West, now I've had other conversations with people in different places in the world, but in the West, for the most part, people know who Jesus is. And if they don't believe in Jesus as Lord, they usually have a very good idea or a very good reason for not believing in Jesus. And it almost always has something to do with someone they know who has shown them a Jesus that they do not see as credible. And it's not the fault of Jesus, clearly. It's the fault of the individual who has embodied Jesus in a way that's not helpful. But this is a really important concept. You are not who you are when you talk to another. At least initially, you are the person they think you are. It's important to understand that. You are not who you are, but who they think you are, until you give them a reason to think differently. And so that's why it's so important to be patient and recognize the immensity of the conversation. Listen to what the other is saying, because they might have had a really bad experience with someone else who called themselves Christian and immediately associate you with that person. And though that may be unfair and unjust, it's simply the way things work. Then I think, I have to be careful how I say this, because I've had some people be, really offended by this, but you've got to be aware of the strangeness of Christianity, meaning the idea that the Christian faith is even believable for some is preposterous. And I wish I had understood this better back in my younger days. Some of you know my story where I played professional baseball in Italy, and trying to convince people of why they should believe in Jesus. Most of these young people were atheistic simply because they had not seen a Christian faith presented to them that had any kind of basis in reason, at least in their experience. And I don't think I appreciated enough the strangeness of a belief that my life could be remarkably changed by a man who lived in a country, an isolated small country 2,000 years ago. And what he says about life is ultimately true today. That's just a strange story. Now, those of us who are believers, we believe that since we were children, and we've never questioned that. But recognize that the story that we believe is strange. Now, there's an opportunity there, and we'll talk more about that. If Jesus came and said everything that everyone ever expected him to say, then there would be nothing unique about the Christian faith. But what he says about life is so remarkably different than how most of the world lives life out, that it's the strangeness itself of the Christian faith that may ultimately be that which brings someone to belief. But we have to recognize it's a difficult story to embrace. And then the idea, too, that we're offering. We're not demanding. It's a really important idea. You watch your language. Don't say this is absolutely true. Offer it. Suggest things. The tone in which we present our message is as important as the message itself. And take the opportunity of bearing witness seriously. I mean, this is a really important, life-changing thing. Concentrate on one matter at a time. Declare the strengths, the limitations, the weaknesses of one's own warrants. In other words, the areas in your life where you have some difficulty, be open to that. Show appreciation for the other person's good points. Practice sincere humility and modesty. If you don't know the answer to the question, don't make one up. I think one of the things that most hurts the Christian faith are those who see themselves as being the answer people, and so they always have to have an answer whether they know the answer or not. We've got to be honest in our approach to this. But I want to go back and remind you that one of the great advantages in this discussion is one that we sometimes shy away from because we don't necessarily name it. But remember that what we've talked about from the beginning of this class is that faith is not something that we have to defend as a Christian that no one else dabbles in. Now, there are some, like Richard Dawkins, who defines faith as blind trust in the absence of evidence or even in the teeth of evidence. Now, what that means is Richard Dawkins, for the most part, has encountered Christians who would take that first position I talked about earlier, it's faith and reason in tension, and who disavow there being any real purpose for reason. And so that allows Richard Dawkins to believe that faith is just something that silly people embrace. But truthfully, as we've talked about it, it's a part of the human condition. All live by it. If you need to, go back and review the course introduction where we talked about the function of faith as a second-order story, that everybody lives by faith in something. They place value in something because they think it returns value to themselves. Okay, with that being true then, that means the advantage is everyone is really trying to understand what faith they should invest their life in. They will not audibly use those words, but if it's a part of the human condition, then we need to know how to present it as such. And here's what's really important, and this is where I would categorically disagree with those who suggest that faith and reason are in tension with one another. Because I think for someone to have faith, it has to hold true even if not provable. Meaning you have to have answers for the objections that one might have toward your faith, though you're not going to have all the answers and you're not going to have perfect answers. It has to be believable to you. So it has to be, while what you believe may not be provable, it has to at least be an extension of that which is provable. So it must hold true, or you will not invest your life in it. So the Christian way of seeing things makes cognitive and existential sense of reality, offering a powerful, persuasive, and attractive account of ourselves and the universe. And we need to be able to defend it at that level, so that Christianity not only makes sense to us, it also makes sense of us. And if you're listening well here, you understand then this is what I was talking about in terms of that second approach to faith and reason, that when you come to understand the presuppositions of faith and understand them well, it redefines how we even consider that which we know. But even there, that has to be based in some kind of understanding and, for lack of a better term, knowability. meaning that something has to be based in belief and provable truth, so that when we're asking people to reconsider their lives in the context of this new story, it becomes clear to them that this is a livable and amazing story, and that's what gives them the opportunity to consider this. Now, what I want to step into now are what we call the classical arguments, and each of these, by the way, have uncountable volumes of books written in the defense of them. I'm going to present them very quickly. You can even look them up on Wikipedia, and there are various websites available that really do a good job explaining the various arguments. But I want you to be aware of these and the various forms of these, also being aware that my presentation here is going to be quite simplistic simply because we don't have time. We could spend easily a lecture on each one of these arguments. The first and most basic of all the arguments for the existence of God is known as the cosmological argument. And this idea is that the cosmos exists, and its existence is it dependent on something outside of itself. Is the best argument for the fact that that which now exists is the best argument that it came here because someone caused it to come. Now, there are multiple forms of this argument, supported by some of the best-known philosophers in history, and some of these arguments are being developed as we study together. Two major forms, however, of the argument. The one is the Kalam, or the Kalam argument is the one form. The temporal cosmological argument is another way of talking about that. And then there's the Thomistic or logical cosmological argument. And they are significantly different. Here's how they work. Basically, the Kalam or temporal cosmological argument is the idea that whatever begins to exist has a cause. And the basis of this idea is that the universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause, and God is seen as the temporal first cause. And so it's, if you've ever seen one of those complex designs made out of dominoes stood up, and then someone pushes over the first domino, and the cause and effect is that the entire design of the dominoes then fall in succession. The idea is for something to be here now, it has to have been caused by something that began that. And so here, God is explained as the temporal first cause. However, when Thomas Aquinas came along, he believed that argument had a particular weakness, because how could you prove that there was a first cause if you could not go back in time to do so? And so Thomas' argument has recently been redefined by Gottfried Leibniz, and that is, for every existing thing, there has to be an explanation of that existence. And so this would not be temporally identified, but rather it's the cause of something. There has to be something behind anything that exists. So the universe has an explanation of existence, and that explanation is God. And the universe is an existing thing, therefore the explanation of the existence of the universe is God, and therefore God must exist. And this idea is that God is the principle or sufficient reason. So if we go back to the last argument that I made, where you have the idea that something had to start the first cause to start this whole thing, and then you have the Kalam argument that God is the first cause. In this way of thinking, God would be the basis, the foundation that the dominoes are set on. In other words, something could not be here were there not a reason for it to be here. So God here is the principle of sufficient reason. So basically, this is the cosmological argument. So any argument that has to do with if something exists, it had to get here somehow, is some form of the cosmological argument. Perhaps one of the more popular arguments is that which is presented by C.S. Lewis in his book Mere Christianity, and it's the axiological argument or the moral argument. And it's the study of the nature of values and value judgments. These arguments are advanced by many scholars and philosophers, and there's a growing number that are embracing this particular philosophy. If God did not exist, objective moral values and duties would not exist. And objective moral values and duties do exist, therefore God exists. And so here, God is a universal moral lawgiver. And by the way, I'll quickly say that with each of these arguments, there are those who effectively argue against those particular arguments. I have a book in my office that presents each of these arguments along with the negative response to each of these arguments. And there's a solution to that we'll get to in our next presentation. But what I want to do right now is just basically show you the various approaches that have been used through history to demonstrate the believability in a God. And this one is particularly compelling because we continue to find cultures that have never had any interaction with other cultures. That's almost unbelievable in today's world, but there are still untouched cultures. And they seem to operate by some of the basic same moral values. And the question is, in the absence of any particular divine being giving these ideas, where did they come from? Now, the teleological argument is one of the more popular arguments in today's world. And it's basically explanatory inadequacy of the neo-Darwinian natural mechanisms with respect to observed biological complexity that has allowed for this theological argument to experience a great resurgence. Okay, basically what that means is it's not that evolutionary processes are non-thinkable. I don't deny those at all. It's the idea of undirected evolutionary processes that have become very problematic. And part of this is simply because the more we've learned about the way things function, the more micro level we've been able to looking at subatomic particles. We no longer live in a Newtonian physics world. Those of you who study quantum physics understand that when you get down to subatomic particles, those particles do not behave in predictable ways. And so as we've gone deep into the inside of the subatomic particles, we've also gone deep into space and seen how everything works together in such a complex, marvelous way. Now, there are those who argue for chaos, but for the most part, the universe seems to suggest such order that it's very, very difficult to have belief in Darwinian natural mechanisms to produce such complexity. So here's the basic argument is very simple. X is either designed or the result of chance. X is not the result of chance or natural law or a combination of both. Therefore, X is the result of design. So you have the idea of design in the universe, and this is also what you may well know as the idea of intelligent design. Teleological argument simply means that there is design, so there must be a designer. Richard Taylor had an interesting addition to it when he says, especially if that which is designed communicates reliable information, then it, by its very nature, it has to tell you that there's a purpose behind it. And so what he's arguing, he gives the example of, to this day, if you take the train into Wales from England, you will see a beautiful garden that from quite a distance you can see a hillside in deep green with large white stones that say, "Welcome to Wales." Now, you could ask the question, how did those rocks get there? Is it possible that they got there by chance? And of course the answer is, given enough time and enough different conditions, yes, it's possible that those rocks just appeared there. But if those rocks then communicate true information, meaning that is actually the border of Wales, which it is, then that necessitates design. And so the way Richard Taylor's argument works is this: if your body functions to communicate reliable information, then that can no longer be the result of just non-directed by chance theoretic evolutionary process, naturalistic evolutionary process. The answer must be because the mind works to communicate reliable information. That information itself would suggest that it was designed for that very purpose. So in this argument, God is the designer of the cosmos. One of the strangest of the arguments, but also one that philosophers say holds great merit, is the ontological argument. Of all the arguments, it's the only a priori argument. What that means is all the others, you're looking at evidence and explaining the existence of the evidence that you're viewing. An a priori argument is an argument that begins before you look at any evidence. So it's simply an argument created in the mind. It's extremely complex, and you find it in many different forms. And this idea is that God, by definition, is a being greater than which nothing else can be conceived. It is greater to exist in reality than to exist only in the mind. Therefore, God must exist in reality. Otherwise, he wouldn't be the greatest being. Some would suggest that this is simply wordplay, but there are also great thinkers like Alvin Plantinga, who has really developed this argument in compelling ways And so here God is the greatest possible being. The experiential argument has many supporters, but also there are weaknesses to all of these arguments. But the experiential argument is just simply it's an argument as inference to the best explanation. We're going to come to that more in the next unit. But can it be truth? Can you have an experience that is truth conveying, or might it be deceptive? So we have four categories of religious experience. You have the deceptive claim, and all of us recognize there are those who say that they've had visions of God that are not consistent with what anyone would believe about God. You have completely subjective experiences with no objective reference, which we might call a mirage or a hallucination. Something out of the ordinary but wrongly claimed as divine. I mean, divine, this is sometimes just a matter of coincidence when something happens that can be explained in other ways, but the person to whom it has the experience, they are convinced it's some kind of divine revelation. But then there's also the possibility of a valid experience of divine reality. So is there any way of judging? Well, this is more than just having an experience of God. This is sort of a universal human experience, and that is this deep longing within humankind for something more. It's what some thinkers call a deposed royalty, meaning there seems to be something in all of humankind that desires a greater reality. And then a numinous experience that permeates Scripture. That's where, like Isaiah and others throughout Scripture, have these direct visions of God that prove to be life-changing. Perhaps the one of the best known of the numinous experiences would be the conversion of Paul, who went from being a persecutor of the Christians to its greatest evangelist. So how do you explain that other than they actually had an experience of God that changed the direction of their life? And then the transformational experience, dramatic change, which would certainly again refer to an experience like that of Paul. But I continue to see this today. Only recently have I encountered an individual whose life changed dramatically because of an encounter he believed that he had with God. His life demonstrates every aspect of that change being something real. And so the experiential argument, while it has some weaknesses, when you see remarkably changed lives, at least it needs to be considered. Then you have a lot of new arguments that we call existential arguments. I have a book in my office called Existential Reasons to Believe in God. And here you have the nature of existence and certain unexplainable universal qualities that are sought and valued, such as beauty and music and justice and relationality. And so the formal existential argument works like this. We have an ardent longing for a God who guarantees the eternity of consciousness. Believing in God who guarantees this satisfies this longing. Therefore, we are justified in believing in God. And so the very understanding of the existence of reality then gives us an opportunity to justify our belief in God, because we find such deep satisfaction in believing in the God who's created us for His joy. But recognize here too that there is the deeper argument that we'll talk more about later on in the semester, that it's hard to explain the universal understanding of beauty and justice and music and other things. I know of musicians who have come to faith because they see the language of music as something that is too transformative and too supernatural to simply be the result of misdirected or undirected natural consequences of evolutionary processes. There has to be something more to this. Then there's the cumulative moral argument, and we're going to talk more about this in the next section, because I do think this is the strongest of the arguments. And that's not just associating with the moral aspect as this one does, but it is an argument of inference to the best explanation, which we'll call the abductive argument. Again, we'll talk more about that in the next unit. But when you take moral facts and moral knowledge and moral transformation and moral rationality, and you pull all that together, what best explains the existence of those things? And they don't have any grounding in a non-meaningful universe. If there's not meaning behind it, why would we have these deep concerns within our life? If God exists, then we would have been created for a reason and purpose, imbued and invested with a telos, a goal, or an aim. And so we have this ontology of goodness and oughtness that seems to be universal. God is the ultimate good. God is the source and goal of our lives. So deliberative and reflective moral considerations are meaningful only in God's story. Things are either meaningful or they aren't. If there is no God, there can be no true meaning. It's just simply social construct. And what this points us toward is that there must be something that goes beyond the scientific horizon. That even in science itself, there is an act of faith. That is the law of causation. It cannot be proved. It can only be assumed. That is, that things result from certain other things, and we might know that to be true now, but might it be that in other times and other conditions this would not be true? We can assume it, but we can't prove it. Now, the fundamental virtue of science is that it only answers questions on the basis of evidence. So faith is not a blind leap in the dark. Faith may go beyond reason and evidence, but it does not or should not go against them. It continues their lines of thought. So, as Albert Einstein, who was not a believer, said, the eternal mystery of the world is its comprehensibility, meaning the very fact that we can delve into this, and the fact that we live in a complex, multi-layered universe, and we have these different sciences of physics and chemistry and biology and psychology, and they engage with reality at different levels. And while science can have great value, it can't answer questions that go beyond that which is subject to evidentiary research. For example, a birthday cake. Science can analyze its contents, but it can't explain what happy birthday means. Meaning lies in other realms of science. Or consider music or great painting. Why do you find those compelling? So, one of the things that I find really ironic is that Richard Dawkins recognized the deep need to explain what science could not explain. And a lot of these questions that were raised to Richard Dawkins, because he is an adamant non-believer in God, he had to come up with some kind of mechanism that would give meaning to the questions that I've raised above about all these different ways in which meaning seems to be so clear and hand-on. So he came up with a thing called memetics, which is an approach to evolutionary models of cultural information transfer, meaning that somehow these ideas are handed on to different generations through a meme, which is some kind of a particle within the cell. But that science, that idea has been thoroughly disproven. So nature is open to many legitimate interpretations. Science, classical science, is neutral. The big question is, which is the best explanation of the totality of the way things are? And so a Christian viewpoint then would approach all of this information this way. C.S. Lewis speaks of his deep belief in God, not so much just because of God's self-revelatory nature, but because of what it does to illuminate all other things. So he believes in the sun, not just simply because he sees it, but because of how it illuminates everything else. So it makes sense to believe in God. Heart, head, reason, imagination. It all points toward there being meaning and purpose. And belief in God gives us a way of framing the world, allowing us to see it properly and to participate in it in a very legitimate and meaningful way. And while faith speaks more about transformation than explanation, it still explains our world in a consistent and helpful way. So Christianity is characterized by its intersystemic elegance and its extra-systemic fecundity, meaning its ability to produce amazing works. And when you think about, I know there are negative portrayals of the Christian faith, and there have been certainly negative events through history by the distortion of the Christian faith. But when you recognize the work of arts that it has produced throughout the world, and the hospitals in the world and institutions of education, there is no other faith that has done more to promote learning than the Christian faith. And so what it gives us an opportunity to recognize is an idea that I presented much earlier in the semester that I first encountered reading a book by James Sire called Naming the Elephant. He said it's not so much when you look at the instrument that you're awed by it, although a telescope can be quite impressive. It's when you look through it, you see something you would not otherwise see, and you know it to be true. And so what does the story of Scripture say about our world? And does it tell us something that we otherwise might not know? And so we come to the end of this discussion and ask ourselves the question, might there be a better way of us putting all of this together and understanding that faith requires a deeper understanding of the world, and that if God created both the world and our capacity to learn, then somewhere those things need to intersect, and all this needs to come together. And so for all the arguments that I presented in this lecture, I do think the one that is most compelling is the one that we've not looked at yet, although we've begun to just sort of consider it, and it's the idea of inference to the best explanation. And in the next presentation, not only will I talk to you about how all this fits together, but I also want to look very intentionally at some of the biggest objections of the Christian faith to see if we might consider those as well.